They were serious walkers and they were serious talkers. If you think the walking that Wordsworth and Coleridge undertook was gentle strolling to enjoy the scenery, you are horribly wrong. It was very arduous hiking. Often they would cover distances of up to 25 miles in a day. I forget how many kilometres that is. Do you all think in kilometres over here? It is 40 kilometres in a day. During these protracted walks, Wordsworth and Coleridge talked, debated, formulating their poetic principles, often composing when they were walking. Anyway. Coleridge talked too much. By the end of his life, his talk had attracted a cult following. He was then known as the Sage of Highgate. Bedridden and opium-addled, Coleridge was visited by a circle of devotees who simply wanted to listen to him talk at them on a range of subjects. His speech was consistently brilliant, but not always lucid. It was rambling, imaginative, hard to follow, but extremely well-read, well-informed, and eloquent. I want to use this term, conversation, as a key idea to understand Coleridge's mind. And like other terms we've encountered this semester, we need to set aside the more familiar, the more obvious associations with conversation to consider what conversation means specifically to Coleridge. To start out, conversation is always an investigative mode to Coleridge. It's not simply an exchange of ideas. Conversation is a process in which he probes things, examines them, tries to find something out that he didn't know before by deliberation. In the conversation poems, Coleridge achieves systematic reflection on ideas that interest him. I'm going to look at the ways in which these philosophical investigations rely on dialogic aspects of the conversation poems, the other voices Coleridge includes that give the poems shape and direction. Keep in mind the idea of Coleridge rambling on incoherently, because this is his inclination. He needs to use literary devices to rein in his philosophizing, and he accomplishes this, for him, unusually effectively in the conversation poems. Some information on how this genre came to be defined. Coleridge affixed a subtitle, A Conversation Poem, to the Nightingale, which he composed in 1798. To his earlier work, Reflections on Having Left a Place of Retirement, Coleridge added an epigram from the Roman poet Horace, Sermoni Propriora, which can be translated as more suited to conversation. In 1817, Coleridge gathered some of these poems and similar ones under the heading Meditative Descriptions in Blank Verse. So Coleridge doesn't refer to any group of his own poems as conversation poems. That's an invention of later critics, which we use to group together around 8 poems which have common features. Coleridge described himself as an inquiring spirit. In comparison with Wordsworth, he once wrote, "He is a real poet. I am only a kind of metaphysician." By the word metaphysician, Coleridge alluded to his philosophical interests, which were often quite abstract, and his sense that the primary purpose of his own poetry was to investigate philosophical issues. Therefore, a significant reason for the ambiguous nature of Coleridge's most famous poems is that he rarely sets out to communicate a particular philosophical point or a moral. Instead, he uses the act of poetic composition to reflect on such issues. As readers, we accompany Coleridge on a journey, uncertain what conclusions he will reach, if any. Different kinds of poems facilitate different kinds of philosophical investigation. In the conversation poems, Coleridge abandons the more rigid verse forms he had favoured earlier in his career when he wrote sonnets and poems in heroic couplets. The relaxed blank verse of the conversation poems allows calm reflection. Coleridge doesn't structure these poems in stanzas. They unfold in verse paragraphs of variable length, exactly as much poetry as is needed. The philosophical trajectory of these poems begins with and returns to scenes of domestic tranquility. Therefore, these are conversation poems because of the homely setting and the easeful blank verse that has the air of talk with a familiar companion, usually confirmed by Coleridge naming an addressee in the poem. A third conversational aspect of these poems is a dialogic pattern that recurs throughout, not only in the ways that the addressees are described reacting to the poet's speculations, but redoubled in pairings of cause and effect that Coleridge identifies in the natural world, hypothesis and consequence that he reflects upon in less worldly philosophical conjectures.